I don't remember the year or my exact age, but sometime in the early 1990s, I became enamored with the idea of Alaska. Maybe it was reading Call of the Wild that did it, or the nature documentaries I'd occasionally catch a glimpse of on television, or perhaps it was simply this concept of a vast land that was largely uninhabited that existed right here within the United States. All I know is that for a large portion of my preteens, I was somewhat obsessed with the very idea of the last frontier. In the early 2000s, that interest was renewed through learning about the story of Chris McCandless, an adventuring young man from Virginia who sought his place in the world amongst the rugged landscape of Alaska, only to eventually succumb to its environments. It's a tragic and strangely inspirational story. Now, armed with a renewed interest in the Bigfoot subject, I've been exploring Alaska through the lens of eyewitnesses and researchers alike. Through these discussions, I've come to find that not only might Sasquatch live here, but even thrive. I rented a cabin on the outskirts of Healy, Alaska, just down the road from where Chris McCandless was last seen. I decided to put myself in a location where I might have at least a decent chance of seeing one of these monstrous Sasquatch for myself. For 3 nights, I stayed in a primitive cabin on private property just down the road from an active sighting location. I did everything the researchers I've spoken with told me to do. I hung trail cameras, baited a tree with peanut butter, and then I waited to see if anything happened. True to form, Bigfoot didn't appear. That didn't mean my little side trip wasn't without incident, however.
Okay, so this is technically night number 3. We have not had any activity out here other than some weird sounds. The closest thing I can think of to describe them to would be your classic like baby crying stuff. It sounds like children, but we've actually looked around and can't find any homes immediately surrounding this location, this house, this property, where there would be children. So that's pretty weird. We're not really clear on what's going on there. We've heard what sounds like a child laughing or calling out or something a couple times.
On the Kenai Peninsula, over 500 miles away, Alexander Petikoff and Eli Watson were wrapping up their expedition to Area A. They had experienced something that sounded suspiciously similar. Experiences which have a historical precedence in Alaska that goes back hundreds, if not thousands of years. I'd had no direct encounter with whatever was creeping around my primitive cabin near the Denali National Park. While I'd have welcomed some sort of sighting or interaction, I was slowly becoming more aware of the darker side of the Sasquatch subject here in the 49th state. Fear about what might be lurking in the mountains and forests here was beginning to creep in. A fear that grips many when they come to this wild, untamed region.
So right now we are on the Stampede Road, which is the Stampede Road and Trail. This is obviously a very famous area because this is the road where Chris McCandless was dropped off, and the trail continues on, and his remains were found in that Fairbanks Bus 142, 28 miles from the end of this road here. I just think the connection between, this being one of the most famous missing people cases in Alaskan history perhaps, and worldwide. People know about Into the Wild, that whole saga, and connecting it to the other weirdness that we've been hearing about that we're kind of looking into. I think it just kind of makes sense. I'm not saying Chris McCandless was abducted by Bigfoots or whatever, but there's just a lot of these other weird kind of stories you end up picking up.
The history of Bigfoot in Alaska starts with reports of hairy men coming down out of the mountains and killing prospectors. So when you get into the earliest settlers that were here after the natives, you're getting into these stories that immediately get real dark real fast.
Or for me at least, what I've noticed is that it seems to be a little eclectic in terms of, we've talked to some people who haven't even heard Sasquatch stories, and some people who have oh yeah, they're all over the place. And then even still, there seems to be a stigma behind it. So I think that's really interesting because you don't get that in places like Oregon or Washington as much. And I didn't think Alaska would be like that.
We've been hearing about various Alaskan Bigfoot activity. One of the things that keeps coming up is this idea of baby crying, which we're familiar with in places like Pennsylvania, but there's the baby crying and then the whistling and some of the lore associated with those things.
You do have the First Nations lore of baby crying sounds in the woods. If you look at some of those First Nations stories, it's almost like they're trying to lure women into the woods. That's part of that lore. It's almost like there's a tricksterish kind of thing going on. And a lot of those earlier, the native stories do talk about, they have different types, right? Some are more tricksterish, some are more the cannibal, some are more stealing people. I can imagine maybe a case or two where something like that might have happened, and that story kind of snowballed, and then people were very scared of maybe going into certain areas. Place got a certain reputation. I don't know, it's just something really kind of interesting to think about.
There's this big boom right now in pop culture of looking at Alaska through the lens of horrific killer Bigfoot, right? And a lot of that's rooted in, again, what we know is actual history of the state with places like Port Chatham that were abandoned supposedly due to killer Bigfoots. What I want to do is dig into those stories and actually figure out if there's any truth to them, if there's an oral tradition here that relates back to this, and see if we can get to the bottom of what is actually behind this myth of the killer Bigfoot in Alaska.
Fear is a powerful storytelling tool. As someone who makes documentaries about often terrifying subject matter, it's a tool I've wielded myself. When it comes to the Bigfoot subject, I've never found it to be one that initiates anything even close to fear. Fascination, curiosity, some sense of naive hope, but not fear. But fear is what sells. Television is rife with shows that hinge on murderous Sasquatch. Some of them, especially in recent years, have even been set here in Alaska. Obviously, narrative horror films going all the way back to the 60s and 70s have long played up the killer Bigfoot angle. Lately, an entire cottage industry has built up around the concept of missing people taken by unknown forces. Often that unknown force is alluded to, or downright directly said to be, Sasquatch. Fear sells, but right now business is booming. It's said that 5 of every 1,000 people go missing in Alaska each year. In a state where the population is around 700,000, the number of people disappearing is troubling. Keep in mind, however, the numerous challenges the average Alaskan faces on a daily basis. Simply surviving the elements and landscape here is difficult enough, but the numerous causes for winding up on a missing persons list in the last frontier are almost limitless.
A lot of people go missing in the woods, and Alaska is no exception for that either, because Alaska is vast, and all the dangers in the lower 48's woods exist up there, but they're bigger and scarier, frankly. Alaska is a much larger and scarier place in general. There's a lot more land to be lost in, and the predators up there are huge. You have the big brown bears that are clearly carnivores. I mean, look at grizzly man, right? You have the black bears, which are also problematic and much larger up there. And you have wolves and all sorts of monsters, basically. So is it possible that some of these missing people go missing because of another monster, the Sasquatch?
So people missing in Alaska. This is a hot topic because it happens pretty frequently. There's a good portion of them who are missing because of man versus nature. You know, we have crazy temperature swings all over the state. You know, it might be 70 degrees in Fairbanks, and then you might have a snowstorm in the middle of summer in Denali at the same day. One of the cryptids in Alaska is actually mountain lions, because we're not supposed to have resident mountain lions here, but they've been seen up into the Kenai Peninsula, and recently they were starting to see them in Delta Junction, which is more in the interior.
Oh my God, you've got bears, you've got moose, and moose kill more people. I believe they kill more people in Alaska than bears. I mean, you get a lot of bear mourns, but moose are extremely dangerous. But bears, even where I live, and a gentleman went missing. They searched for him, I believe, for a day. The bear had attacked him just 10 feet on the trail and dragged his body another 10 feet off the trail, or 15, and was feeding on it. And no, of course, everybody's going up the trail. Nobody thought about to look right here.
In Denali National Park, and I know there's a whole subculture of people going missing in the park, we have had just a couple of people turn up missing or mysteriously dead. In one case, I can recall back in '87, I believe it was, when they were looking for a lost hiker, they found an abandoned campsite. They could not figure out who it was. They didn't have any, the permit wasn't there at the campsite. We've also had somebody in the west part of the park come up missing, and once again, I think they found his tent. They never found him.
I think Bigfoot is a little more aggressive in Alaska because there's so much, it's so vast up here, and people don't really get that until they're here. There's so much space around here that I think when people kind of come across them, they're so not used to it. They take people on as in this aggressive manner because it's like a territorial thing.
About 11, 12, I can't remember. I had been adopted about 10 and a half by my dad. I got up here to Alaska from Los Angeles. I lived here for just a little bit. My dad really wanted me to be outside more. I was used to being in the inner city and orphanages. This was like crazy to me, woods and stuff. So my dad was like, we're gonna go black bear hunting. We were camping one night, and my dad, my brother were sitting around the fire just talking about work and stuff. They worked together. And I had gone to get firewood, and I came back. I'd been around my dad enough and stuff, and he had told me, like, if you feel a presence, you need to get back, because that's something hunting you. You don't understand that being from the inner city. This is Alaska. This is the wild. So I had felt like something was watching me. It really freaked me out. So I come running back, and I went to lay down, and my dad and brother were just up going to watch the fire. They were taking turns on fire. And we started hearing a lot of noises, like not normal. Like this, whatever was big. Frank stood up, and he's a big dude. He stands up, and whatever it was stopped. So it must have seen him. My dad was like, go find what it is. Frank's a big dude. He can take care of himself. So Frank grabs his little, I think he had like 44 Magnum revolver, and he takes off in the woods. He's fast, so he's gone. Had to have been over an hour. I was sitting there just worried, and my dad was like getting ready to go out and go find him. And here comes Frank. He goes flying into there, and he goes, I don't know what the hell it is, but this thing is big, and it is fast. He had chased it near this like rock wall. He could see the rock wall kind of, it was late at night, so he couldn't see very well, but he knew he was close to the edge of the mountain, because when he was running, he was starting to see shale rock under his feet, and he's like, I'm getting closer to the base of the mountain. He stopped, and he said he heard it stop too. And he said it didn't move. I couldn't see it fully. It was like behind this bush. Like it was kind of like he saw like a shoulder past like a piece of like brush. And like it was just standing there, and you could see like something was swaying, but it wasn't like a tree branch. Like it was like a big blob. And I was like, how big do you think it was? And he told me, he goes, I'm 6'10". That thing was probably about 2 feet taller than me. And he picked up a rock and threw it. He just like picked up a piece of shell rock. So just a little piece, and see what happened. Something flew past him that was bigger, like a piece of wood or something. So he takes off, comes back to camp, and he told my dad all of us the stuff. That night I went to sleep, and we were hearing noises like crazy, but they weren't normal noises. Like you'll hear like a coyote or a wolf, and we started hearing like things being thrown in the woods, like rocks or sticks or whatever. I remember my dad's like, we're gonna stay here for one more night and see what happens. I'm like, God, no. But it never came back, and it never came back to camp. And that was the only time I remember that, and it was really weird. My dad, so this is the other thing that bothered me. So this whole thing about the story that bothered me was that my father and my dad are like outdoors guys. They've hunted every animal in Alaska. There's literally no fear for my dad. Like he used to get Kodiaks like people hunt deer. He's like not even afraid. And my dad was worried. He's like, this thing was hunting us. This wasn't like a bear that stumbled upon us and like was like, ooh, this is a bad idea. This is something hunting. And I was like, why do you say that? And he goes, because just the way that it walked up on us, that's how a hunting animal hunts. And he goes, I believe that it saw you, your tiny little butt walking around, and it thought you were an easy meal. And when your brother stood up, it second guessed coming into their camp. He goes, if he hadn't stood up, it probably would have jumped into our camp. And he told me the reason was because whatever it was an apex predator. And that's a very scary situation. I was like, why would you be scared? He goes, an apex predator has no fear. He goes, it might have been skittish. He goes, but if it really wanted to attack, it will attack.
Within state, what are some of the terms that people use describing it?
The Nantinak is probably the most well-known right now because of Port Chatham. There's also the Bushman, the Harryman, the Gilliak is something that people up here in the interior and towards the Arctic Circle have for him. That creature, according to Alaskan natives, is the cannibal. That's what they call him, the cannibal. He actively hunts and eats people. They have a very strong fear of him.
Like being native, we have something called Inyokun. They're big, they're dark, like black. They are hairy, but I think they're a little bit skinnier. It's like a spirit, but it's physical, but it can disappear. It can move things around, it can do things, it can take you. I don't know where they take you. It's kind of like a Bigfoot. Maybe it is a Bigfoot, who knows? I don't know, but it's something different there. It can appear and disappear. I mean, it'll leave tracks and do things. And
I guess one of the big things about Bigfoot taking people is a lot of natives in Alaska, they don't want to talk about Bigfoot, because if you talk about Bigfoot, it might draw the attention of Bigfoot, and then something might happen, whether it's someone gets taken or your food stash or whatever gets taken, something's going to happen. But they think simply the act of mentioning it and discussing it will bring them around. With Bigfoot, you do find a lot of stories about Bigfoot taking people, and there's also some stories within native lore of like these hybrid Bigfoot native children as well. You just have to dig around for those kind of stories, but they're out there.
The natives seem to have stories that revolve around Sasquatch or hairy man being a little more aggressive in terms of kidnapping women and children. And for me, it kind of I had the thought of, well, a lot of these stories that are told in our cultures are sort of a warning tale. It's a cautionary tale, right? Maybe this only happened once. Maybe, a person got lost in the woods and they blamed it on the hairy man. And that became the cultural story, just to keep the kids at bay, keep the women from wandering too far off and getting mauled by a grizzly bear.
kind of historically, can you walk us through the history of Sasquatch sightings in the state? Like, what are some of the oldest known sightings?
The one in Valdez at the top of the Valdez Glacier, and that's in 1895. Abercrombie was a captain there to kind of do like geophysical survey type work, and they used to go up the Valdez Glacier to get to the Eagle Trail to go to the Klondike. That was one of the ways for the gold rush. They were freighting gear up the glacier. That was one of the ways to get up there. It was like a father and son. The son had been attacked by Sasquatch. Then the son ended up being killed. It was supposed to be the glacier demon that was up there. And then the father had come back down, and he's all distraught trying to tell this story. And of course, all the other guys that are there are like, "Oh yeah, that's probably it," because they had seen it or something. Or there's parts of it that are hard because there's not like names. The guy's name, the Old Swede. Well, who was that? If you had a name, then you could look at a census record or something and track it down a little bit further. But
where did you find that story?
It was probably a Library of Congress, because he was there doing the geophysical survey kind of stuff, and that was just an incidental story to his surveys.
In the 30s and 40s, there were many miners that wouldn't go past the King Salmon River here in the Ruby type area of Alaska because they believed that the other side of the river, the northern side, was the Gilliak territory and you could get eaten or taken. There was an encounter where 3 hunters were hunting caribou up there in around September or August, and in the night one of them was killed and taken off somewhere, and they had an entire village out looking for him and never could find him.
So another story involved a Bigfoot trying to take this guy, kidnap him, and they decided to swim across the Tanana River. And if you're in Nenana, you go across the Tanana River and there's this big giant hill. This thing swam across the river with this guy, but in the process, the guy ended up drowning. So Bigfoot let him go and kept swimming to the other side of the Tanana River, which is kind of a wide river, and it ran off into the woods.
So do you think Bigfoot is responsible for a lot of missing people, or?
It's quite possible. In that time period before the Alaska Highway was built, when this was more miners and the native population here, now that's urban. I mean, you got blacktop everywhere, so that, then you got the drugs and all this kind of other stuff. So, but early on in Alaska history, I think there was more disappearances because of that, yeah.
Are you aware of any stories that you personally believe, or like a missing persons case that might be attributed to?
Well, I can't say any names, but years back there's a village that 2 guys went missing. There was 3 in the group. They had went to a cabin for an elder to get it ready for his trapping season. It was late fall. They walked back. They had planned on hanging out at this cabin to party for a weekend and set it up for their elder. So they got there, they basically got it set up in a couple hours, and they were just hanging out in the cabin. Well, they heard a noise up on the roof, and then something was going on just outside the door, and it lured him out. Well, his 2 friends were in front of him. The first one that went out, he said, was snatched. He didn't see what happened. The guy was just out of view, and the other guy behind was yelling, running around the corner, and all of a sudden there's something grabbed on him. As he came out, he turned around and looked back up, and something was on the roof, and there was 2 other ones that had his friends, and they were doing various portions of ripping them apart. He took off running. 2 of them jumped on the one and the other one, and he said he'd stopped behind some trees and turned around and looked, and one of them had tore his friend's chest open and was just like scooping blood from the cavity. When I first heard it through someone else, I thought, that's bullshit, I mean, really. But when I talked to him and he told me it, you talk to that guy with his eye twitching, because it never used to. I've known this guy my whole life, and that eye twitching like that, something very bad happened, but it's labeled as a missing person. So they chalked it up to some drunk delusion, and didn't really follow through with what he was telling them happened. And I think there's a lot of that happens in some of the remote villages. It's easier to deal with, oh, he was drunk, he was hallucinating, versus actually the reality of what he said happened. Now this was told to me from one of the guys that got out of there. The other two did not.
Native lore repeatedly warns of hairy men taking women and children, while newspaper articles and historical accounts recall tales of settlers running up against bloodthirsty wild men. Indigenous peoples caution against following whistles or baby cries heard while in the forests. According to legend, these sounds are emitted by the hairy people in an attempt to bait in an unsuspecting victim. Often these stories end in the death or disappearance of a woman or child. I don't know what to make of all this. It flies in the face of the secretive, shy forest ape that I've learned about over the last decade back in the lower 48. But you can't escape this side of Sasquatch here. Maybe there's no better example of this than the tale of the abandoned town of Portlock, also known as Port Chatham. Port Chatham has come to prominence in recent years thanks to its notoriety as a town that was attacked by Sasquatch and subsequently abandoned. The truth behind the abandonment of the town doesn't quite align with the legends.
I guess talk to us about Port Chatham.
It's beautiful. It's majestic, almost like going into a fairy tale. Untouched, and there's only 300 people there in the summer, 150 in the winter. That was where the original town was.
From my understanding of it, there was a chrome mine down there and a fishery, and there was a very large community at one time. It had a post office, a school, a hospital, and for some mysterious circumstances, people just started abandoning the fishery. They abandoned the mine even though there was still chrome in it.
The story goes that Bigfoots or Sasquatch hairy man, Nantinak, I think as they were calling him, were killing people in the woods, and that's why they abandoned the town.
And they had so much activity all the time, and really bad things happened there. They moved from there because of Bigfoot.
And it had a lot to do with people being found mangled in the woods or in the bogs. It had a lot to do with people saying they were being harassed by some creature.
It's a 15 kind of year period where it wasn't just overnight that everyone packed their bags and ran out, but I think it was the 1940s and 50s is really when the town sort of died, because less and less people were needing to work off the land and harvest some of these resources, and it just sort of faded off.
To scare off an entire town and abandon the settlement when there was really plenty of fish, plenty of resources. Whatever was happening out there was enough to drive everybody away.
I think that there's a lot of that kind of thing, and I think that there's a lot of, I don't want to say population because you never know exactly how many, but there's a lot of activity around urban areas, settlements and things. Just like coyotes, they're here, they're raiding smokehouses and chicken coops and this sort of thing. Near a village, the village or the human activity associated with that would be, curiosity, plus it's a food source.
I was told by somebody whose grandmother lived in Port Chatham that the stories of the Nantinak hairy man were true, that there were encounters, but it wasn't really alluded to that they were killing people or massacring people. There were probably people that died that maybe got crushed by logging equipment, and that was then blamed on the hairy man, and that was a kind of cautionary tale. That's just, from my perspective, that sort of makes sense. Like with some of those tribal stories, similar kind of human way of sort of explaining a weird occurrence and blaming it on something folkloric in nature.
What I've noticed is like certain areas back home in the fall, I don't know if the activity's heavier, but more people are there in those places in the fall, because during the summertime we're out on boats fishing. So when everyone comes back in the fall, you got moose hunting and caribou hunting going on, so everyone's kind of splitting off and going up the rivers, and that's when usually there's occurrences happening. But I think they're all through that watershed. One sighting after another, missing people, just all sorts of different things.
Do you think there's a connection between a lot of these missing people reports around the state and Bigfoot?
I think there's a good chance that there's a portion of them that do go missing because of it. It's hard for people that haven't been in the deep woods of Alaska. There's a feeling in the air, and I've done this most of my life. Even now to this day, when I go out into the deep woods, you get this feeling like, unless you felt it, it's hard to explain it. It's just an awareness. You get hyper aware real quick, and it's like this feeling of, what is that? There's just something, something different about it.
You said you're interested in David Pilates' work. Are you aware of any legends or stories about Bigfoot taking people or?
Around here in Nunwalek, people have disappeared. They had 2 surveyors went missing when they finally sent somebody to go look for them. They did find them way up higher, sitting on a tree. They didn't have their legs. A lot of the people there that I know have all seen, and they're so scared of Bigfoot there.
So people are going missing in Alaska. It's established fact. Sasquatch researcher Michael Thompson had spoke with me about this idea that there were multiple types of Bigfoots here. Whether offshoots of the same species or different creatures altogether, he isn't able to say with any certainty. I've always had my own personal issues with the idea of multiple types of Bigfoot. It's hard enough to believe one massive, hair-covered unknown being is hiding in our own backyards in the lower 48, let alone multiple types. But in the land of the midnight sun, legends of mysterious creatures are as much a part of the landscape of lore as traditional hairy apes are. The disturbing trend seems to be that many of these legends revolve around people being taken or killed by one of these legendary beings. Here in Alaska, it isn't just the known animals that want to maul you, but apparently everything hiding just out of sight does as well.
What about other cryptids?
There are actually a lot of other cryptids in Alaska. We do have a lot of little people reports. There are some giants in the north, but little people are actually, I think, even more prevalent than Sasquatch as far as Alaska Natives are concerned. They're always portrayed as a little impish, mischievous type creatures. They are considered negative most of the time. They tend to cause trouble. They'll harass you, throw rocks at you, sometimes like Sasquatch do. They'll play tricks on you, try to lure you away into the forest and get you lost.
There's probably more than one thing in the woods. The smaller 4 to 5 foot folk, they're supposed to be hostile. They're supposed to have worse attitudes than Sasquatch. Sometimes I think maybe that might have something to do. I think they're basically at war with people, and if they have a chance, they deal with lone hikers, possibly. And once again, I don't want to think it.
Down in the Homer area, there was a family that said that the wife had started seeing them around her house up in the trees, and they terrified her. Eventually her husband saw one, and they started to notice that the trees in which these creatures were being seen were starting to die, and they eventually left that home. But when they came back years later, all the trees on the lot had basically died, and they attributed that to these little people. There have always been hairy man or bushman stories from Alaskan Natives and hunters, things like that.
Bushmen are like a non-contact tribe. So there's like some spiritual, supernatural kind of stuff that has risen up around them. But they are not Bigfoot. And Bushmen are also said to kidnap people. And from what I was told by this native guy who's a friend of mine, he said that Bushmen will kidnap you and no one will see you for 7 years. He said it's always 7 years. I think some missing people are probably taken by Sasquatch, but I also think there's some missing people that get abducted up here. I'm a big UFO researcher on top of Bigfoot stuff. UFOs get seen in just like really remote areas, usually by pilots or something. Who's to say they're not taking people and running experiments or something like that?
There are a lot of reports in which people will see strange lights in the sky and will have a Bigfoot encounter around the same time. There are also a lot of just strange UFO reports in general. But there was a report of two gentlemen that they were seeing and experiencing things like wood knocks, strange noises, kind of Sasquatch-like behavior. And then a couple days later, they found a circle of dead animal carcasses, and they had seen strange lights in the sky the night before. And then these animal carcasses were from several different kinds of animals. Like there was a caribou and a moose, but the strangest one was they said they had found a dead orca in this circle, and they were hundreds of miles from the coast. So there's no way that this animal could possibly have come this far inland. And that to me is one of the strangest UFO type phenomenon in regards to any kind of Bigfoot activity in the area.
We've begun wading into waters here that only help to further muddy the Bigfoot topic. UFOs and folkloric creatures tend to turn off a lot of level-headed people to the entire subject when you start integrating them. However, it's difficult to broach the topic of missing people without delving into some of the alternative theories as to why they might be missing to begin with. While a large portion of the cases that seem mysterious might have mundane explanations, there are still a standout number of them that defy logic. But what is behind them? I struggle to jump to a paranormal explanation for many of these reports, but I'm equally hesitant to consider that Bigfoot is out in our forest taking everyone they see. I've always thought that if Sasquatch is responsible for the large number of genuinely bizarre missing people reports, then we definitely have more evidence, or even definitive proof that these things exist. They'd be leaving behind mountains of evidence as they carved their bloodthirsty trails across the American wilderness. Eventually, someone would kill one in self-defense. There would be far more face-to-face encounters on record as well. But here's where another theory comes into play. Alaska hosts numerous military bases, some still active, and an equal number abandoned. The Aleutian Islands are covered in empty bunkers used to safeguard the Northwest from a military invasion during World War II. It's theorized that there even exists a secret government complex deep in Denali National Park called the Dark Pyramid, a site so secretive, so hidden, and so important that the need to keep it off the radar would trump even the lives it might take to keep it so. Denali, of course, also has a long history of Sasquatch sightings to go along with its mysterious hidden bases. The possible connection between Sasquatch, hidden bunkers, and missing people was illustrated by the strange disappearance of Nathan Campbell in June of 2020.
When people would hear that I worked for the National Park Service, they would get pretty excited. And then when they heard that I worked for the National Park Service in Alaska, they got really excited. They thought I must be on top of some dark secrets.
Government cover-ups.
Yeah. And also the area I'm talking about is getting kind of close to the Dark Pyramid. You've probably heard of that.
Yeah.
I was part of a group to go out looking for this Black Pyramid, and it's supposedly located somewhere about 50 miles southwest of Denali. Supposedly, it's larger than the Pyramid of Giza. It's completely subterranean, and supposedly the military had set up a temporary base there to study it because it was giving off energy of some kind that they were trying to harness or see if they could make use of.
Do you know that somebody actually died trying to get to it?
No.
They haven't really advertised it, but last year somebody was dropped off with supplies for several weeks, and the plane came back and the supplies were still there in the tent he'd set up to house the supplies, but they found no trace of him. Park Service got involved trying to find the person, and they found nothing.
We were unable to go out and do that excursion that year due to COVID reasons. It was right in the middle of COVID, so we were unable to go. And it was very ironic because another fella decided to go out by himself and look for this pyramid, and he disappeared. And nobody's found him. He's still a missing person. And that was the same year we were supposed to go out there. So in a way, there's a part of me that feels like maybe we weren't meant to go.
So, as someone that did work in the park, do you buy into the cover-up stuff at all?
Well, I have a story.
Okay.
I feel a little funny sharing it, but I've had some experiences out near the Denali National Park. I have found logs torn apart. That was along a section of woods where mysteriously there was what some people call a big boy trail in the woods that started and ended in the woods. And it was a place not hiked very often. We have established trails in the park through people, occasionally locally through grizzlies, but a grizzly trail will go under branches that are only about 4 feet off the ground. This trail carefully made it around the branches. This trail was designed for something tall. It was in the woods off of a creek. It looked to me more like an ambush route than the route hikers would go on. So I was off in the woods, and I was quite startled to get into the woods and find this trail, which lasted only about a quarter mile, and then it was gone again. One of the times I had experiences out there, one of the members of our party was a former deputy superintendent of Denali National Park, so second in command. When these things were happening out there, I brought it to their attention and said, I know every one can be explained by something, but altogether is starting to make me wonder. It was just interesting. He didn't try to talk me out of the existence of such a creature. He tried to chalk it up more to coincidences upon coincidence. So I got the impression that he was not hostile to the whole concept of there being a relic hominid out at the Susquehanna River.
In regards to Sasquatch, the government is trying to cover it up. A lot of the military in this area, or former military, I've had gentlemen tell me that they have done Arctic training in the Arctic Circle, and they've been briefed that the government's aware that these creatures are here. If you encounter one, not to engage it, but they might, run across one. And there actually is some reports, I think from around 2010, 2013, about a special forces unit that did find tracks in the snow during one of these training trips up in the north. And they followed these tracks to a little outcrop of woodlands, and they heard a howl or a scream, and it was enough to scare them, and they actually decided to just back out and return to base. They were not going to investigate it further, so they say. I definitely think that there is some government cover-up. I also think that perhaps the government protects some of these wilderness areas because they're aware that these creatures exist in these areas, and they don't want them to be disturbed, and they're kind of trying to keep people out of those areas to lower the amount of encounters with them.
A fully formed cover-up of the existence of Sasquatch stretches the boundaries of my imagination. While I understand the implications that proof of unknown creatures residing in our forests would have on industries like logging or even hunting, I struggle to understand how to connect the dots between the government, our military, and Bigfoot. I can, however, understand the far more believable notion of a small-scale need to gloss over sightings in a place like Denali. Norm's discussion with his superior sounds believable and even further bolsters the possible existence of Sasquatch in this part of the state. It makes sense after all. It's a suitable habitat for these things, and their more aggressive nature in this part of the country is probably due to the fierce competition for food they face. But could it be something else? One of the most well-known accounts of hairy creatures was that of Albert Ostman, who claimed to have been taken captive by a family of Sasquatch somewhere deep in the mountains of British Columbia. He claimed to have escaped his captivity, but not until he'd learned that his reason for being taken wasn't as a meal for hungry creatures, but rather to be a mate for the female juvenile member of the family. It's a bizarre story, but one that draws similarities to indigenous tales of women and even children being taken by Sasquatch and then adopted into a similar family unit. Another early well-known account is the Ape Canyon incident. Most of those already educated on the Sasquatch topic are familiar with it, but a Cliff's Notes version would simply state that in the early 20th century, a group of miners, somewhere in northern Washington, were attacked while sleeping in their cabin by a group of angry apes. The apes hurled rocks at their cabin and eventually tried to gain entry before being warned off by gunshots from the terrified miners. It turns out that this historical account has some modern-day successors, and one of them took place here in Alaska and involved Fred Roll.
One of my elders had planned this gold mining prospecting trip for a couple of years. We were good for a 10-day trip out there to do some looking for pay dirt, basically, some sample buckets for him to file a claim. We get up on the Nuyakuk, and it's a salmon counting tower. So this place hasn't been used in, when we were there, it had probably been close to 10 years that it hadn't been used. And it's basically 8-foot square, 2x4 framing with 5H plywood. And they had the windows blocked off as a blackout. When we got there, we unload and we were contemplating kind of checking things out. But as it was starting to get dark, we figured we would just chill and wait till the next day. So we're inside. My elder had just got done making us a meal a few minutes before, and it was just about a half hour after dark. The whole place just kind of goes, like we figured the wind, but there was no wind blowing. Well, as I look over my cousin's shoulder, there was a small gap, and I saw something dark move out of the way of the window. We're on a salmon river. I was immediately like, bear. So he grabs the rifle. I had that shotgun and grabbed that spotlight. We opened the door to run this bear off, and the riverbank is literally 15, 20 feet to my right as we go out the door, and it's kind of on a cut bank. So we beam and there's nothing there, and we're literally like maybe 1.5 feet out the door, shoulder to shoulder. And as I panned to the left, that's when we saw the 3 sets of eye shine, and immediately we knew something was real wrong, because it's hard to explain the feeling of instant dread. The worst kind of icky feeling on the inside, like you just knew it was all bad. Well, we immediately ducked back in. When we got back inside, he's right here on my left, and he's holding a rifle like this, and when I was speaking to him, it was like everything was muffled. It was almost like talking to someone on a plane when your ears haven't popped. It was similar to that. And I was like, did you see the eye shine? And then all of a sudden, my cousin's underneath that card table. He's got a death grip, and he had wet himself, and he's looking across that shack at the other window. So we look at each other, and then we look down at him, and I still got I'm holding the shotgun in my hand offhanded, and we turn and look at the window where he was looking, and that's when we saw the face in the window. And as soon as I made eye contact with it, within 2 seconds, I shot 3 times through the wall. And then the whole place shifted a couple feet real quick. It almost took me off my feet when the place shifted. I thought they were gonna push us in the river, because we were right there. This face I saw from the bottom of its nose to the top of its brow, and it filled that 18-inch gap. I had no doubt. There was no mind speaker, nothing like that. It was just an immediate understanding that I was food. After the place had shifted, my elder went back and sat on the bunk and was just sitting there. I think he got out his Bible. But my younger cousin, he was under the table, still just looking out the window, death gripping, and I went to get that .30-06 from him because I wanted a more powerful gun, but it was loaded, and he wasn't letting go. He was out there. So when I get him up and I coach him back to reality, because he was still babbling a little bit, it took like a good 3 to 5 minutes just to get him to let go of the gun. You know, I ended up sitting there for hours underneath that lamp, pumping it every once in a while. And I resigned myself that I was gonna die. I just knew that there was no other side to this. It was somehow they were gonna get us. We had a short conversation about how we were gonna get out of there, and our plan was to make it to the skiff, which was about 20, 25 feet away, roughly 20 foot of trail, and then it drops down to landing there at the river. got our game plan. We were gonna get in the skiff and use that spotlight and see the water and just drift away from there. My cousin was like, well, let's spotlight out the windows and see if we see any activity out there. There was an old outhouse about 40 foot, kitty corner off the back corner of this place. So when we beamed, we were looking at the place we saw the eye shine first, and we're trying to sweep back, and we saw nothing until we reached that outhouse, and we saw this black silhouette behind it. It was every bit of like 13, 14 feet tall. The size of it was immense, but what was scary was it was like it was absorbing the light. It was so pitch black. So we saw that, and we saw it move, and when it moved to its left, we immediately killed that spotlight, and we all tucked back into that little cubby. We're freaked out. We got barrels crossed, and we had all the lamps and stuff off, so it was dark. It was pitch dark. I'm not sure how much time had passed after that happened, because it almost sounded like off in the distance, rotor wash, like the near distance. It was like a thump, 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 thump kind of sound. And we're like, and then we started feeling it in the ground. Well, it was one of these things that ran by the window. It ran by, and it was like they were staged around the place, and all of a sudden they were all running around it. And at one point, it sounded like one of them was sniffing the trailer. They could have broke that place and smashed us against a tree, just like that. And that's another question that drives me forward too, is why didn't they? As it was getting lighter, we were getting more brave to make it to the skiff. So we got all of our important stuff. We went out the door. Now, when we go out the door, it only takes seconds. I mean, we were motivated. We get to the edge of the river. My cousin jumps down to get the boat started, the skiff started. This rock bigger than a basketball whizzed by my head. Like, if I hadn't slid back a little bit, we wouldn't have this conversation right now. So immediately my eyes lock onto it. That noise snapped me out of it, and I whip around, and that big black thing was coming out of the tree line. And I immediately, 30-06, I put 3 rounds center mass. Now, I heard the rounds hit this thing. I heard them thuck. I heard the impact. This thing didn't flinch. It stopped moving forward. It still boggles my mind, because it just stopped moving forward. So immediately we get down in the skiff, and we're trying to get out of there. And unbeknownst to me, I found this out years later, they were still chucking rocks at the outboard as we were getting up on step to go back down the Nuyakuk. I don't know. It's hard to explain. I got personal issues, you know what I mean? Not a vendetta, but just personal issues. And what drove that? We got there and we went right into that cabin. We weren't out whooping it up, shooting something. We weren't disrespecting the land in any way. That, in the moment, it's really hard to grasp. But looking back on it, 20/20 hindsight, I still don't have an understanding of it, but it unlocks this primal fear that you don't even know you have. It's really hard to put into words.
Do you think these things are supernatural in any way, or flesh and blood?
Well, I heard it hit flesh and blood. I think they're flesh and blood, and they've just been around forever. I mean, our heritage, it's always been a part of it. Our oral history. The hairy man's always been a part of it.
Folktale, mythology, urban legend, or something else? That's the question regarding the darker side of Bigfoot lore here in Alaska. Thus far, I'd spoke to multiple people with their own terrifying encounters with Sasquatch. I'd heard of the history of missing people in the state, and I'd even delved into the alternative theories as to what might be taking people to begin with. And yet, while Fred's encounter is terrifying and its impact on him has changed how he views the creatures, I don't have a smoking gun. There's nothing definitive yet that could be considered proof that Sasquatch is taking people. So on the Denali Highway, we make a pit stop to talk to a local named Jonathan to learn about a missing persons case he was directly connected to. The case involved a young boy named Billy Pope. Billy's father, Gene, had moved from his home state of Ohio to Alaska, where he'd met a native woman named Matrona, who he married and had 6 children with. Billy was one of these. Jonathan Durr grew up with Billy, and remembers when he went missing in January of 1975. A child growing up in the harsh landscape of rural Alaska learns quickly how to survive in almost any situation, and to do so independently. Unfortunately, even the sturdiest of outdoorsmen have succumbed to the wilds here, and Alaska doesn't seem to make allowances for the lives it takes based on age.
Yeah, we are in, it's classified, if you look on your Alaskan maps, as South Central, but we're really right at the edge of the Denali Borough, foothills of the Talkeetna Mountains, where the Talkeetna Range meets the Alaska Range. I've lived here all of my life, well, most of my life. My early childhood was spent in the Lake Iliamna country, and over there, that's where I got hooked. In the native culture, Bigfoot is as real as moose or caribou or anything. I mean, it's just a given that they exist. Not only exist, are an essential part of the community. Billy would have been 16. He lived at Pope Fenoy Landing, which is an intricate bay. Billy was courting a little girl over in Cockadock. So he had walked to Knock the day before and did his visiting and whatnot. And he was walking home, which, you know, to him that's nothing. That's like walking across the street to most people. The people in Cockadock called Pope Fenoy. He says, yeah, Billy just left. He should be home in about 3 hours. So when Billy doesn't show up, you know, they start going back and forth and say, okay, he should have been here. They retraced his steps. It had begun to snow as well. Major search party from all over the lake went looking for him. And it was so strange because they found where Billy had stopped, and he had built a fire, but like this, where he built the fire was like a lone tree, like away from the rest of the forest. He had like been breaking off branches like this. I mean, it was a place that, you know, it made no sense to stop and start a fire. And then they found the prints, the Bigfoot prints. They had been circling where he had built this fire. And like I say, it had been snowing and kind of raining, so everything was a little distorted. And some people had gone through on the search and made a mess of things before they could really, but they had clear evidence that he was being circled. And they think somewhere in there is where this Bigfoot apprehended Billy and killed him. And, you know, I think he wanted a line of vision because he knew he was being followed, and he had to be scared to death to be snapping off those branches. And that's the last they saw him, and there was, you know, the speculation, did he go through the lake? Well, no, they never found any evidence of that. And besides that, you know, he had grown up there. He was not going to fall through the lake. And despite the fact that, you know, he's light as a fox, he could walk on it. Picture this, if you will. It's a stormy night, and the rain's pouring down, and I'm sitting with his father, and I said, well, I got to know what happened to Billy. And he says, oh, it was Bigfoot. We didn't tell the press that, but we all know it was, and we found tracks.
Billy's story isn't that unusual here. People go missing all the time, after all, especially individuals living on the outskirts of civilization. It's also not unusual for there to be rumors or stories that grow up around the disappearances. Upon returning from our Alaskan trip, I was able to learn more about Billy. His family suffered a string of tragic events following his disappearance, including subsequent disappearances of two brothers, Tommy and Gene Jr., the death of his mother, and his older sister, Dolores. Alaska continued to claim his family after his passing, and today Billy Pope is remembered by his friends and the family still remaining. His death wasn't reported on in the local news or talked about on social media. He was simply gone, vanished. And in his place, there is now an empty hole that those who knew him have tried to fill with questions and answers that could help make sense of where he went. One of Billy's friends, and the last person to have seen him alive, anonymously divulged to us that he didn't believe Sasquatch was responsible for his disappearance at all. The same night that he went missing, a massive snowstorm dropped over 4 feet of snow across the region. So what are the Bigfoot tracks that Billy's father recalled seeing? How could tracks even be visible in 4 feet of snow? It's possible that in searching for answers, a grieving man grasped at the one thing that could offer a solution. A monster from the forest took his son. Or maybe it's true. Maybe there was a bloodthirsty Sasquatch wandering the area who just happened to bump into Billy on his path home. Whatever the case may be, time has killed all hope of learning what happened on that winter night in January of 1975.
Could they possibly be a little more aggressive? Yes, there are some stories where people have said they've been a little more aggressive to get them out of a certain area. But then you also have stories that, consist of curious creatures staying just outside that campfire light, looking in. I think any being, whether it's them, us, can be aggressive if provoked. If you're in their territory or, they don't want you there. Rocks being thrown, the wood knocks, the howls, the chatter, stuff like that. What does it all mean behavioral for them?
There are a couple accounts I heard of where it appeared to be curiosity, but when someone is panicked, it's aggressive. You see what I mean? Even if it's just seen and maybe shakes a tree, they can easily, out of fear, take that as, a form of aggression. A
lot of the Alaska Native, the superstition is that if you're in their territory, they will take you. They'll take you away, or they will kill and eat you like the Gilliak would.
Sasquatches are obviously very intelligent. They're primates of some sort of great ape. How closely related to us, another great ape, they are remains open to question. But clearly, if they're anywhere in our family, they're the smartest things out in the woods. Yeah, they're not using fire, they're not doing math, but they're obviously very intelligent. So is it possible that some of these missing people go missing because of another monster, the Sasquatch? Yeah, sure, it's possible. I don't think it's shouldn't be the first culprit that you point your finger at. I think it's entirely possible though, because Sasquatches are not your forest friends. They're not out there in benign Disney-esque landscapes picking flowers and giving them to you. They are animals trying to survive. And Sasquatches are smart animals that can survive in a variety of ways. Other ape species have grabbed babies and whatnot and ate them. There's stories from Washington of Sasquatches doing the same thing. Sasquatches are wild animals of the scariest type because they're human-like wild animals. Because we're the real monsters. So Sasquatches actually resemble the real monsters.
I'm thinking about Sasquatch a lot. If I hear noises, I'm kind of paying attention to what's going on around me in the woods. I start listening and I'm hearing stories that are blowing my mind and just aren't what I grew up hearing from the old timers. And I start getting a little more flexible. Maybe there's something else going on. Maybe I do have to rethink this, and I start rethinking it. Well, maybe it isn't a dumb forest ape that's just really good at play hide and go seek. I have a sudden epiphany, and I don't believe this is true or anything to worry about, folks out there. But my epiphany is, if Sasquatch really wanted to, and in considering people like me or even just people in suburbia, if they wanted to, they could push people out of rural areas back to population centers.
I don't. Yeah, death by Alaska is real common. I mean, you get a mile away from the village, that's death out there. You know, I've been dealing with it my whole life. I mean, Alaskan can kill you without even trying. I mean, so many, good men and women have woken up one morning and by noon they've run into something. It happens around here a lot, but not 16,000 people. So something's going on out there.
People go missing in Alaska all the time, every year. I mean, Alaska's the end of the road. You guys probably did your research coming up here to see how many people have gone missing in the last 20 years up here. Can you attribute that to Bigfoot, Sasquatch, the hairy man, whatever? I don't know.
The connection between missing people, Alaska, and Bigfoot is unmistakable. It's there. The concept of Bigfoot taking people has been a part of the lore as long as there has been a Bigfoot lore.
Well, yeah, I mean, that goes right to the First Nations accounts. A lot of those stories and of these things come in, they take our women and children. That only needs to happen once for that to become a story that then gets told. Keep the village kids from going too far out. But like you said, there's this weird kind of connection there, and probably more so than I would even like to assume. I mean, Alaska's the kind of place that it chews you up and spits you out. I mean, the woods out here are no joke.
Historically, the sightings of Bigfoot that then correlate to some sort of missing persons case, even in the modern era, do exist. And you can't just write all of that off. It's also, if you think of Bigfoot as a natural creature, it's going to be some sort of apex predator. It's massive. It's capable of taking people if it wants to.
Yeah.
It's somewhat intelligent. We know that about it. So the odd missing person being somehow attributable to Bigfoot, I'm on board with that idea.
I mean, there's a lot of cherry picking going on, I think, nowadays in terms of sensationalizing that. The killer Bigfoot story sells. This creepy encounter stories sell. I mean, majority of encounters of Bigfoot across the continent are pretty mundane. Somebody saw it crossing the road, that sort of thing. These creatures do have personalities and differences. There may be some that are just mean and nasty that want to do something malicious to humans. Maybe they've had a bad experience. They've been shot at. Who knows? Whereas overall, it seems like Sasquatch is curious but not very aggressive. Although, like we said, that is sort of the popular depiction as the killer Bigfoot.
I don't think it's common. I think especially in a place like Alaska, like Alex was saying. I mean, especially even the places that we went to. If I would have fallen off a cliff and died, no one would have found me. Not even Alex. It's too thick. And there's too much happening, I feel like.
If 16,000 people missing are all attributable to Sasquatch, or even a third of that are attributable to Sasquatch, we would 100% know they exist.
Right.
There's no way that many people go missing without us finding out that they're
Somebody would do something, most likely the government.
I do think we have far more questions now when it relates to Alaska, missing people, some of the high strangeness aspects of what we've learned. I'll be back to the state simply because it's absolutely breathtaking. Like the wilderness here is what we've been looking for in various other places around the United States. I would come back here just for the sheer scale of it.
I didn't come to the last frontier in search of terrifying Sasquatch tales or looking to push a narrative about killer Bigfoots. I didn't set out looking for the darker side of Sasquatch lore, but it certainly found me anyway. Whether you view the entire topic as little more than mythology, or you're a dyed-in-the-wool believer, Alaska will challenge the way you view Bigfoot. Maybe you think Bigfoot is simply an undiscovered species of ape, basically a mountain gorilla or a chimp, but one that walks on 2 feet and has managed to avoid us for centuries. Well, Alaska will throw stories of human-like forest giants and tiny monkey devils at you to challenge that notion. Maybe you're of the opinion that Sasquatch is a friendly forest creature, a benign being who curiously observes us from the shadows but secretly wants the best for mankind. Well, it turns out that there are hundreds of years of native oral tradition and legends, not to mention newspaper and written accounts of man-eating, baby-stealing horrors that lurk just behind the trees. Like I said, for yourselves, thanks to television and numerous books that push the killer Sasquatch angle far more than the more mundane encounters that make up the bulk of the topic. There are even people too afraid to journey into the woods behind their own homes. Fear not only sells, but dissuades us too. Dissuades us from searching for answers for ourselves. Dissuades us from living the life we're called to live. My response to this is simply to remember the earliest peoples to travel the last frontier. Indigenous people who fought constant challenges in order to not only survive here, but thrive. To seek fulfillment where none else dared seek it out. Sure, have a healthy fear of the wilderness, but more than that, respect it. You can even replace the word wilderness with Sasquatch if you'd like. Those most hardy of outdoorsmen have died in these mountains and valleys. Jack London had a quote about this, one I'd read as a young boy, and one that I believe now applies to me and my view of this place as well. He said, "Despite everything, every piece of Alaska sang to me. I remembered every curve in the trails, every tree in the forest. It was familiar to me, comfortable. The more I thought about leaving it, the less I liked the idea." you.